This morning's health segment is sponsored by Advil for headaches, muscle aches, fever, backaches. Advil, advanced medicine for pain.
In the last presidential debate, George Bush singled out Dr. Anthony Fauci as one of his heroes.
I think of Dr. Fauci. Probably never heard of him. Well, you did. Ann heard him. He's a very fine research, top doctor at National Institute of Health, working hard doing something about research on this disease of AIDS.
There were probably many people who didn't know who Dr. Fauci was. He's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and associate director for AIDS research for the National Institutes of Health. He's going to be one of the Bush administration's point men in the battle against AIDS, and Dr. Fauci joins us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
There's a report out of San Francisco, out of our affiliate station in San Francisco last night, as a matter of fact, talking about the notion that AIDS is not fatal. You were quoted in the report, and there is a lot of talk about that this morning. Is there a greater sense now? We've heard about people with AIDS living longer or living longer than expected. Is there a greater sense now that there may be an aspect of the disease that we've reported for so long as being 100% fatal that it in fact is not?
Well, it's 100% fatal if there's no effective therapy. But what we've been seeing over the past year, and we'll be seeing more of, are therapies, either alone or in combination, which are clearly able to prolong the life in a meaningful fashion of individuals who are infected with the virus and who have AIDS. So the doom and gloom of being totally inevitably fatal, I think, is something of the past, that there is hope, and that's the message we're trying to get out to the people.
Do we know also more, though, about the period of time that the disease actually takes place, in which it incubates and then becomes full-blown, as it were?
It looks like it really is quite long. Originally, years ago, we thought it was just a couple of years, but now from the time a person gets infected to the time they develop symptomatic disease, full-blown AIDS, is probably at least 7 or 8 years. So it's a substantial period of time.
And some people are speculating that it may in fact be even longer than that.
Yeah, even longer. And that's the reason why I think it's important to get people to understand why it's important to know if you're infected, and get to a competent physician who could follow you and put you on an appropriate therapeutic regimen if it's indicated.
Yeah. A couple of quick questions. The prospects for a vaccine.
Well, vaccine is going to take a very long period of time. There are a couple of vaccines that are in very early testing right now, and even if we're fortunate enough to have a safe and effective vaccine, it is very likely that it won't be until well into the 1990s. Are
you satisfied with the progress on AIDS drugs?
Well, I think they're moving along very rapidly. Obviously, when you have people who are sick and suffering and dying, that nothing looks like it's going along rapidly enough. But I think the progress in the development and testing of drugs is really unprecedented in biomedical history.
Do you feel like the FDA is moving fast enough?
Well, you know, it's a complex story. The FDA is trying to balance safety with getting drugs out, and I think that the whole FDA approach is now being re-examined by the FDA itself and by people who are trying to prod things along. But they're doing a good job.
It seems like the adult community has grasped AIDS as it is and understands it fairly well. What about kids? Is there not a sense of worry amongst AIDS experts that children, teenagers, and young adults don't really get it yet?
I think that's really a problem, because there's that feeling of a complete invulnerability among adolescents and younger individuals who feel that it's somebody else's problem and they're not really going to have any difficulty with it. And that is a disaster if that keeps up. That's the reason why education at that level is extraordinarily important to prevent the spread of AIDS.
Dr. Fauci, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. It is 4 minutes before the hour, and CBS This Morning continues.
AIDS activists targeted the U.S. government's research headquarters today, asking wider and faster testing of AIDS-fighting drugs. Even as police were making arrests, the government announced a significant change in policy. More on this from CBS News medical correspondent Susan Spencer.
Mounted police and others wearing rubber gloves confronted about 1,000 AIDS activists this morning at the National Institutes of Health, home of government research on AIDS. Police arrested 81, many for occupying the Office of AIDS Drug Development, which protesters said doesn't live up to its name.
The bottleneck is human testing, human trials. They're just not testing enough of the promising new drugs and getting them out the door.
The process does not work. The process stinks.
Although the timing may have been accidental, today the government proposed changing the process. Under a new system, AIDS patients who either can't take conventional drugs or who have run out of options would be allowed to use unapproved experimental drugs before tests even showed they work.
The people who will benefit the most are people who are most severely affected by the disease.
It's a very important signal to the community that the federal government is serious about AIDS research and very serious about getting experimental treatments to people who need them as quickly as possible.
NIH officials say there are at least a dozen drugs that soon may qualify for use under the new system, but they don't expect that to quiet critics.
If you're sick, or you're dying, or you have a loved one that's sick or dying, there is no such a thing as fast enough. Fast enough means when you have all of the answers.
The new policy means that even without all the answers, the government finally has agreed with AIDS activists that patients with so little to lose have a right to take unproven drugs as long as they understand the risks. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Washington.
Oh, yo, look towards the darkness. Nah, yo, look towards the light. Yo, what is that? It's a supernova. Nah, man, that's a black hole. Yo, it's I leap over lies in a single bound. The black prophet, one day I got struck by knowledge of self. It gave me super scientific powers. Now I run through the ghetto, battling my arch nemesis, Mr. Ignorant. He's been trying to take me out since the days of my youth. He feared this day will come. I'm out on his trail, but sometimes he slips away because he has an army. They always give me trouble, mainly hatred, jealousy, and envy. They attack me, they think they got me, but I use my super science and I twist all three. I see sparks over that building, they're shooting at me. I dip, do a backflip, then I hit him in the heart with sharp steel bookmarks. Ignorance hates when I drop it, but no matter what he do, he can't stop the prophet. Poison and knowledge will nourish. Ignorance is a poison and knowledge will nourish. Let's continue the saga, mad drama. I met this chick, she said she knew where ignorance was at. I said where? She said downtown. He had babies having babies and young niggas selling crack. I think the bitch is lying, it's a setup, I can smell it, but ignorance is running rampant. Aight baby, show me the exact spot. Meet me at Hoyt and Skimmerhorn at 3 on the dot. So I hops up on the A train, I'm being followed. My 7th sense is danger. I turn around, it's anger, and he brought a marble on. It's the same old song. Despair and animosity got broke with the swiftness. I don't know what they think this is. I feel a sharp pain in my neck, now I can't see on my hem. They hit me with a dart filled with the pork chop sim. I tried to hold on, but before long I dropped. When I awoke, I was locked in the barber shop, trapped in the barber's chair. Oh no, they're gonna try and cut my hair, but that can't stop the prophet. Some of ignorance's boys. She said, prophet, we got you beat. By the way, I'm Mr. Ignorance's wife, deceit. But enough talk now for your haircut. When the clippers touched my hair, they blew the fuck up. After the explosion, there was no one left. Cause I know them mock, poison hand, touch of death. My vision's still kinda blurry, but I see a clue. Ignorance is at the library. I hurry with lightning speed like the Flash. He's at the big one on Grand Army Plaza. When I get inside, the door shut and the lights go off. Damn, another trap. I hear a hissing sound. I smell a funny smell. I gasp, I can't breathe. Ignorance is laughing at me, waiting on my downfall. But he can't stop the prophet.
Well, prophet, it seems like you're in a bit of a jam. I hope you can unstick yourself. Oh, and what you did to my wife, it was nothing. I have others. The saga continues.
The AIDS epidemic has been well documented. More than half of those who have contracted the disease have died. Many others face certain death. Then there are the victims Barry Peterson reports on now, the ones who live in the shadow world of the AIDS epidemic.
Ned Brown has the AIDS virus in his blood.
Having fevers at all?
No fevers, no night sweats.
Great.
My glands are about the same.
He has active symptoms, but is not classified as having AIDS because he doesn't have the cancer or pneumonia or the other deadly complications that are officially recognized as AIDS.
There haven't been any more people that we know that have expired, have there?
No, not that I know of.
Doctors say he has ARC, age-related complex.
Even gay people who've lost friends to AIDS, I think they wonder whether you're a hypochondriac or what exactly this is.
What it is a huge hidden wave of the AIDS epidemic. More than 13,000 Americans have been diagnosed with AIDS. Half are already dead. But AIDS experts estimate that 10 to 20 times as many people may have age-related complex and may pose an even greater danger in the spread of the disease than those with AIDS.
People with AIDS, for the most part, their immune system is already pretty much destroyed by the virus. People with AIDS-related conditions have more immune system, therefore more home for the virus, and they are probably more contagious even than people with AIDS.
More worrisome, those with ARC are often well enough to continue working and to continue an active sex life.
In all probability, I have only 3 years to live.
He had age-related complex, but it became AIDS. Now his roommate has ARC.
You have to change everything in your life. Everything.
Will he, too, get AIDS?
We know that after 2 or 3 years, that those individuals, approximately 25% of them, will go on to develop the full-blown disease.
That uncertainty, says Richard Rector, is the worst part of having age-related complex.
The possibility that tomorrow I could die, or tomorrow I could be alive, and not knowing how to deal with those emotions.
Researchers say there is a hopeful side to all of this, that those with age-related complex stand the best chance to benefit from any new drug treatment. That's because their bodies still have some immune system left, still have some ability to fight off this deadly disease. Barry Peterson, CBS News, San Francisco.
This morning's health segment is sponsored by Momentum Muscular Backache Formula with medicine for your backaches.
A new study this morning has found that some people may be infected with the AIDS virus for years without its detection by common screening tests. The research is published in today's New England Journal of Medicine, and it raises the concern once again about the supplies of our nation's blood banks. Joining us now from Washington, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the Associate Director for AIDS Research at the National Institutes of Health. Good morning, Dr. Fauci.
Good morning.
Really, what should we get from this study, that we really don't know how many people have AIDS?
Well, I don't think that you can make that broad statement regarding total numbers of people in the United States. I think it applies specifically in this case to the group that was studied, which were a group of gay men who were continuing to practice high-risk behavior and who had negative antibody tests, and yet virus was able to be isolated from them. That tells us that there exists a state of latency of the virus, something we knew for some time now, but the numbers in the case that were published today in the New England Journal of Medicine are higher than what had been estimated before, but I don't think you could make the extrapolation to the general population at all on this.
How can the AIDS virus hide for about 3.5 years?
Well, the AIDS virus has the peculiar characteristic of being able to insert its own genetic material into the genetic material of cells in the body, particularly these cells that we call lymphocytes, and literally stay there for an indefinite period of time. When you don't have an antibody response, that means that not enough of the virus was expressing itself in the body for your immune system, your surveillance system, to recognize it and make an antibody. And that's virtually what happened with these individuals that were studied. The virus was there, but the body was unable to recognize it to make an antibody response, which is the test you use to determine if someone is infected.
So should we worry about blood and blood banks?
Well, the story with the blood bank situation, I think, needs to be explained, because these individuals, as I mentioned, were people who were practicing high-risk behavior and were admittedly practicing high-risk behavior. In the blood donation pool of people, of blood donors, these individuals, from every indication that we have, are voluntarily excluding themselves from donating blood. So you would not expect to find a large pool of people who are practicing very high-risk behavior and were still knowingly donating blood.
Now, are you discounting this study?
No, I'm not. I think it's a provocative study. It's interesting. It extends information that we knew some time ago. It needs to be followed up. It needs to be corroborated in different populations of patients, and it needs to be repeated by other laboratories, because some of the techniques that we used were very highly sensitive techniques. Different types of control experiments need to be done. No, and I'm not at all discounting it, but certainly more work needs to be done before we can make any far-reaching broad statements about it.
But should we implement stronger screening procedures in blood test labs?
Well, that really at this point would be impossible, because the available routine screening procedures are the ones that were negative in these cases. There is the very sensitive, what we call polymerase chain reaction, which is able to detect the presence of genes of the virus in cells, even if you can't culture them or have an antibody response. To do that broadly over the general population, just logistically and technically, would be impossible at this time, not to mention the fact that that technique is so sensitive that there may be even false positivities there that need to be ironed out at the research level before you can apply it to the general population of screening.
You have research you're presenting next week at the 5th International AIDS Conference that has something to do with this hidden AIDS, doesn't it?
Yes, well, actually, my own lab and other laboratories throughout the country and the world are studying what are the precise mechanisms that can trigger a virus that's latent in a cell to ultimately produce itself. What is the conversion factor? What types of factors induce what we call expression of virus? That's the kind of research we're working on, and hopefully that will give us some insight on how you can keep the latent state in a latent state as opposed to having production of virus.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you so much for joining us
You're
this
welcome.
morning. It's now 19 minutes before the hour. We'll be back.
In the search for new and effective treatments to fight AIDS, some encouraging news tonight. There is still no cure, but the latest research on a powerful new class of AIDS drugs shows they do prolong life and reduce complications, even for people in advanced stages of the disease. Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has this story.
To see him on the street, you'd never know that Chet Holcomb has an advanced case of AIDS.
You're doing fantastic as usual.
That's thanks largely to an experimental antiviral drug, ritonavir.
This is probably the most exciting development we've had in dealing with HIV disease.
At an annual AIDS conference, researchers today reported their startling findings. In a 7-month test of 1,000 patients in the most advanced stage of the disease, ritonavir cut the number of deaths in half and the number of AIDS complications by 60%. Used in combination with the standard AIDS treatment, doctors believe they now have the weapons to stop the HIV virus.
Perhaps ultimately we will be able to use these drugs to actually eradicate virus from the body.
But experts caution that the studies are so short-term, no one yet knows if the HIV virus will outsmart this drug as it has so many others.
The unanswered question is, what about the real-world situation where someone has several years to go? They're not on their deathbed.
Advocates for AIDS patients are also worried the new drug will triple the cost of HIV treatment. The bill, they estimate, will rise from $5,000 a year per person to $18,000.
The greatest paradox is we've got these new therapies which clearly work, but will we be able to use them?
Still, AIDS researchers who've hit so many dead ends over the years think this time ritonavir has finally given them something to cheer about. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, Washington.
Still to come on the CBS Evening News from our new CBS News World.
A decade ago, a controversial AIDS activist organization made national headlines for the first time. The group ACT UP, which stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is planning another protest tomorrow to mark the anniversary. Troy Roberts looks back at what the group accomplished or didn't in 10 years of making headlines.
The city police are going to arrest you.
ACT UP marks 10 years of activism with an appropriate call to arms. Over the weekend, AIDS activists have been plotting a commemorative anniversary protest in New York on the scale that the group has been famous for.
We need to start pushing the drug companies.
ACT UP stormed onto the national scene at the height of the epidemic when there were few AIDS drugs available. With a sense of guerrilla theater, their radical tactics dramatically changed the face of AIDS and how the medical research establishment would respond to the disease and other chronic illnesses.
They acted up to get attention, and then they came in with some very important messages.
AIDS cure now! Through civil disobedience, the group effectively pressured the government to increase funding for AIDS research and insisted that promising experimental drugs be made immediately available.
We've demanded these therapies and access to health care to save our lives.
But there are some physicians who believe the group's tactics have hurt AIDS treatment.
The rapid release of drugs, yes, has led to some confusion about, a great deal of confusion, I would say, about how to treat healthier people who are HIV infected.
Sure. Today, there are 10 approved antiviral drugs, including 4 protease inhibitors, effective medications that have eliminated traces of HIV in many AIDS patients.
Their blood counts are going a little bit higher. They're putting on some weight. They're feeling a little bit better. The night sweats are not quite as a problem, and they're starting to feel better.
With no cure for the disease, the group still has unfinished business. But with a dwindling membership, ACT UP is a shadow of its former self. But on Monday, ACT UP returns to its roots with a protest on Wall Street against high drug prices. Activists promise to be confrontational and loud as always. But after 10 years of acting up, can the group still command attention and create change? Troy Roberts, CBS News, New York.